So I'm Rob McGovern. Cover a lot of different areas inside of Logarithm. For now, I'm representing labs in our compliance team. We have Bob Swanson.
Yeah, I'm a principal compliance engineer for our Logarithm Labs, the division of compliance research.
And then our third guest speaker is all of the frameworks that we could talk about today. So this whole presentation is set up as a choose your own adventure. We've got a few minutes that we're going to cover of background, and then it's going to be up to you to decide which way we go. Whether we talk about a specific framework, we talk about compliance in general, we can go lots of different directions. The one thing we can promise, there will be a lot of acronyms. Yes.
Yeah, so just because we have a pretty diverse group of organizations and the level of maturity in your compliance may vary, we want to ask a couple questions to understand kind of where you're at in your compliance pursuits. So we'll go with a share of hand or a raising your hand. Yeah, show of hands.
Who's been through an audit or had to deal with a compliance breach?
It's rough.
Yeah, it's rough. It's rough. It's never fun.
So how many of your organizations have not one but many compliance frameworks that you have to adhere to?
Yeah, must be. Right. It's never just one. Do you actively use your SIM for compliance purposes? Or only when you have to?
That's actually one of the reasons why we went with you guys, is because your compliance packages.
Excellent.
I'm here to find out how.
All right, perfect.
And then how many of you actually know the scope of your specific compliance frameworks, like in terms of systems, processes, people, data, what's in scope and out of scope? Anybody have a really confident, oh yeah, we got this, we know, we got visibility. Yeah, it's,
All right.
it's a tough
It's not uncommon. That's just one of the hardest parts of compliance, is knowing what's in scope and what's out. So last question, this should be the easy one. Would you like to help your company reduce the risk of significant fines, jail time, or loss of reputation?
Why not?
Yeah. At the end of the day, that's what compliance is all about, right? Somebody somewhere has said, if you do this, you either get access to things you can't access otherwise. PCI. If you want to process credit card data, you've got to be PCI compliant. Or they said, if you don't do this, we're going to put you in jail or fine you. SOX, HIPAA, great examples of that. Or they say, hey, it's generally considered a good idea to do this, and if you do this, then maybe there'll be benefits for you later on, and that might be like certain aspects of the NIST cybersecurity framework as an example.
Yeah, but a big one, Rob, is loss of reputation. That can be monumental if you're relying on that reputation to drive sales and things of that nature.
So we think that next-gen SIM, all the stuff you're learning about here today about Logarithm and where we're going with SOAR and UVA and all the rest of that, plus where compliance is moving. And compliance is not a static thing. It's really evolving, and it's actually evolving probably more rapidly in the last year and a half than I think it ever has. Put the two together and you got money. You're controlling that risk and you're managing things. So next-gen SIM, we've talked a lot the last couple of days about SOAR, security orchestration, automation, and remediation. If you're building playbooks, build them for compliance. If you're looking at smart responses and mitigations, that could be the difference between saying that I am partially managing this control in the compliance framework, or I'm fully managing the control in the compliance framework. And some of that's as simple as I can prove it. I have metrics, I have monitoring. UEBA. So many of these frameworks are moving more towards truly understanding your users and user behavior. That's going to be a big, big play in next-gen and future compliance. Cloud-ready, data lakes, and DevOps, these are things that we hear a lot about in next-gen SIM. They are also driving value in terms of compliance and compliance frameworks.
And then we talk about next-gen compliance and how that drives SIM. We look at GDPR and how that's a privacy-driven data protection framework.
Anybody have to comply with GDPR? Yeah. Was that fun? No?
How many people like reading legislation and not having any controls to derive from it?
Yeah.
Well, that's the general counsel's job, not my job.
There you go, exactly. Find your legal counsel.
Right.
But then also...
Just don't be declared that you're what's the term of GDPR? The person.
Oh, the data protection officer?
Data protection officer, that's what I was saying. Yeah. Too many acronyms.
Yeah, make sure you have a DPO.
Just to make sure you duck when everybody says raise your hand if you want to be the DPO.
So GDPR, we look...
You
Oh, yeah.
No.
So GDPR, we look at that from more of a global perspective. Even though it's EU driven, it's influencing a lot of global business. But even here local within the states, we're seeing state level legislation come out. California was pretty, the initial push for it. Colorado has recently established one, and a lot of states are following suit in terms of protecting consumer data. So how are we adjusting our businesses, our policies, our procedures, and our control design and implementation around that.
And it's affecting everything. I mean, the way Google did their finances is impacted heavily by GDPR because they offshore their revenue, which means it's all under purview of GDPR. Oops. Now they got to figure out what they're going to do and how they're going to work with it. So GDPR is having a big, big drive on compliance kind of across the board. It's changing compliance frameworks, it's changing the way we have to think about it.
Yeah, and then jumping down to this last bullet, many organizations have multiple compliance frameworks to adhere to. So how, as a SIM technology, we're a central collection of data, how can we streamline this for organizations and for ourselves? And how can we find common objectives across multiple frameworks? Because when you look at the frameworks, and we've kind of had the privilege of doing this over the past 4 years and looking across many frameworks, where there's privileged access management controls pretty much straight across the board. There's certain control objectives that can be facilitated by one AIU rule. And so that's one of our core objectives that we're starting to implement in terms of our module design.
Yeah. Antivirus and vulnerability scanners are part of almost every single framework, so might as well make one set of rules around that are focused on what a vulnerability scanner can and can't do and how you mitigate it, as opposed to making 15 copies for 15 different compliance modules.
Yeah, a lot of noise.
Yeah. So 2 important announcements before we get into the choose your own adventure side. And you can't have this kind of a talk without at least one cat picture. The Consolidated Compliance Framework, that's what Bob was just talking about. We launched this last year. We're starting to roll all of our modules into using it. If you want to know more about it, one of the sessions that we could do today is around advanced compliance. We talk about Consolidated Compliance Framework quite a bit. And of course, you got to have the second picture, especially with the weather we've had.
Yeah.
NIST, the updated NIST module is coming very, very soon.
It is. We currently have people working on it, and
Top people.
Yeah.
Bob.
And so it's a pretty big module for us, and it fits in with CCF because we treat NIST as an influencer, especially 853, in terms of other frameworks derive their objectives from 853. So we're using actually 853 Rev 5, 800.171, and CSF all in this NIST compliance automation suite.
Right. So this is the choose your own adventure part. If you want to have us keep talking about NIST, and we're happy to do that, we'll jump here and talk about NIST. If you want to know basics of compliance and how just it works in general, you can go there. Advanced compliance is more about taking one of these compliance frameworks and mapping it into logarithm and how we think about it and what we do with it. The rest of them are all specific to certain frameworks. So we want to talk about GDPR, happy to go there. Got a few slides around that. HIPAA, high-tech meaningful use. Anybody in healthcare? One? Okay, probably not going to talk about HIPAA. PCI, DSS, NIST, Sarbanes-Oxley, and for international folks, we've got the Monetary Authority of Singapore. Anybody doing banking in Singapore or Southeast Asia?
No hits so far.
No hits so far. Darn. That's kind of a fun module because it's basically the Southeast Asia version of Sarbanes-Oxley.
Yeah.
And it's built off the Sarbanes-Oxley framework. So,
anything of interest that sticks out to you?
Basic or
Basic.
Basic or PCI?
okay. So we'll start with basic. We'll probably be able to cover 2 of these.
Yeah.
And since we haven't talked about basic today,
I know.
it's nice.
New slides.
Basic compliance with the SIM. So simple, right? You start with some sort of governing body, whether it's government or industry or who knows what, and they come up with some ideas, laws, rules, regulations, controls. They have different names every single time. We map that into what we call control groups and controls, specific things you have to do to make that compliance work. And then in the end, it's about some sort of audit and enforcement. So generally, compliance is going to hit these 4 things. Kind of the who, the what, the details, and then how do I tell that I actually did it?
Yeah, and there's different audiences involved with each of these processes. And so when we look at something like GDPR, we stop at laws, rules, and regulations. If you go to NIST, say 853, you get all the way down to the granularity of them giving control attestation guidance.
Right. And it's so simple, except the governing body could be one or more governments, industry groups, or even specific companies. There are some compliance controls that are company-driven, and they've just set a standard that everybody has to follow. The laws, rules, regulations can overlap. They change often. They vary by jurisdiction. They can be interpreted differently by different auditors. Yeah, kind of messy. Who knows really what GDPR is? We're still waiting for those court cases, and they're all out there right now. Control groups and controls, very interpretable in a lot of cases. It can be vague, definitely overlapping. Sometimes they're mutually contradictory. You guys ever seen those in the compliance modules? You have to restrict any root access, but you have to also know, you have to not have any root access, except that you have to have root access for certain conditions. Yeah. Audit enforcement can vary widely, depending on the compliance type. If you're looking at something like HIPAA, it has to be reported in a 24-hour or 48-hour period, and your name and company name will go in their investigation and it will be public. Something like Sarbanes-Oxley, it'll probably end up in a bunch of lawyers, and 2 years later you might have some sort of accounting fine, but it won't actually show up as a Sarbanes-Oxley breach. All depends on those regulations.
And so a big thing with our compliance when we're designing these modules, we understand that customers come in at a different point on a maturity model. In terms of first-time adopters, that's like, hey, we got to be PCI compliant yesterday. And what do we need to do to get there?
His introduction to compliance was having somebody come tell you, I need a report showing every Windows system we have and whether we're logging it. I mean, why? So don't ask why I needed it yesterday. Yeah, that's kind of that early adopter stage. You're hinting into compliance.
Yeah, and the readiness phase is where you've started to go through audits. You're beginning to understand that we have to implement policies and procedures and train our people. And this is starting to move in the direction of identifying control gaps and making remediations. Attestation this is where you get in more of a routine of periodic audits. You're actively remediating gaps.
You're following your checklist, basically. And that's about the level, is I've got a checklist and I can follow my checklist.
And you have formal policies and procedures that are leveraged and continuously updated as things change in your environment. And then the mature side is organizations that have really closed that remediation gap where your audit report gets shorter and shorter. It's a beautiful day. I was there when it happened for us on my old company. It was awesome.
And you start doing things like when you do threat hunting in your SOC environment, you actually will call your threat hunting out about a control.
Yeah.
And then you're doing both compliance and security at the same time and really getting that joint benefit of the two together.
Yeah, and really that's why when we're mapping our controls, we map it to content first in terms of like AIE rules, reports, investigations, but then we also map it to downstream functionality, whether it's specific threat modules, it might be the use of case management as an IR tool, it might be enhanced features with Netmon, user identity, and all of that, what we're trying to do is to take from, basically provide a roadmap where you can go on maturity level of your compliance, and once you get to a good point, you can pivot into more of a security organization, and because you have compliance as the base around your SIM to give shape and structure, it actually allows you to pivot pretty easily into some of those advanced content delivery methods.
Right, so on the SIM side, it almost always starts with some sort of system inventory. What's in scope? You know, what are we monitoring? Do we have log sources from those things we have to monitor because they're in scope? Are we getting the right kinds of logs from those systems? That's a critical part of that compliance maturity process.
And then data risk assessments. This is understanding your data, where it lives, how it's processes, who touches it, and if it's breached, how's it going to impact you?
Right. And then we get into privacy risk assessments. It's not just about the data itself, but especially if we're dealing with PCI, HIPAA, or GDPR, there's very specific controls and constraints around privacy of that data. Who has access? Why do they have access? When did they touch it? Why did they touch it? Can I prove when and why and where they touched it? That sounds horrible. I should really rephrase that statement.
And then, obviously, at the end of the day, what matters to us and what matters to our executive team is that audit report that comes out that identifies control gaps. And then it's not only how are we remediating this, but how are we baking those remediations into our SIM.
Right.
And one thing I'll say towards this, if anybody tells you that compliance modules for Logarithm SIM come out of the box ready for you, you are depriving yourself of a ton of value, because I've been on the side of being my dark days as an auditor with Deloitte all the way to being an internal advocate for program development. These activities take an immense amount of time. They take a lot of conversations with many business owners and things like that. This is all immense value in terms of giving structure to your data within the SIM. Leverage this, please, when you're using our modules.
And it flips right into your security posture. I mean, if your SOC is all about risk management, what's your biggest risk? This stuff. And the better you understand that, you understand what you have in your environment, the easier it is to control and mitigate your risk from any kind of security perspective, much less from a compliance perspective. So how does this SIM help? Fundamentally, it's about to collect, parse, and enrich logs and analyze logs for security events. That's what a SIM does, bread and butter. And then we kind of branch into two paths. And the top path is monitoring alarms around controls. We want to set up alarms that focus on those controls and show that we're actually watching them and responding to them. Because that's the difference sometimes in an audit or a compliance breach from hey, you've got 60 days to go fix it, versus, hey, your name is on the front page and your company is a $10 million fine levied against it. And then the second half of that is auditing those controls. So being able to report, to show metrics, show statistics, show that we're actually following our own process. And all of this area together is, again, drives right into compliance with proof of the controls or compensating controls. We can't do exactly what the compliance says. I mean, sometimes do stuff around it and show that hey, we've thought about this and we've wrapped it a little bit different way, and that often works. And then it really drives auditability and breach awareness and response.
Yeah, breach awareness and response, Rob, is so fundamental because there's so many objectives that say, hey, you got to respond within 24 hours, and not only respond, but you have to have a full understanding of the breach itself. So when we talk about things like case management and web counsel, where you can dive in and take all that context that you're starting to derive from your investigation, you can create case management to centralize all that information that demonstrates your understanding, and then you give access to the auditors within the SIM with a restricted profile, and then they can see that case and understand, hey, they have everything organized, they demonstrate their understanding, and have taken the right remediation actions.
And don't forget, they go together. You can often fund your SOC by access compliance funding pools. When you get told I have to produce all of these reports and all of these audits, and it's part of my Sarbanes-Oxley, some of the money that goes to that Sarbanes-Oxley should land in your SOC. You can staff your SOC by pulling in GRC, governance and compliance. Try cross-training them into security. It's really the same stuff, right? And you can impress your auditors, very much impress your auditors with NextGen SIM. We had a customer not that long ago who went through a PCI audit, and they had the PCI dashboard we had in place up. And the auditor said, I've never seen anything like this. You've already answered half my questions in an hour, and it usually takes me a week to get this far in. Because they could pull up a list and say, here's what's in scope, here's the log sources we're collecting from and how we show that we've got the right log sources, here's all the alarms that have come from those, here's the subset of those alarms that we feel actually touched PCI data, and here's our time to response on those alarms and our remediation on those alarms, and maybe here's the cases tied to those alarms of how we actually responded and acted, and why we found out that either it was a false alarm, or we fixed something, or we reported something.
Yeah, and then something like Smart Response, how you're actually automating some of those remediation items so that the time, it's like the mean time to detect control gaps, and how you can reduce that through integrating some of our rules and stuff, like say you have a compromised privilege account. We're using a Smart Response that says, hey, I see this AIE rule fired, what do you want me to do with this account? Well, I want you to put it in a temporary hold until my IT ops or security group can go in and make sure it's okay.
Right. And the single best resource in all of that, if you haven't already, and you're interested in any kind of the compliance frameworks, is go to community. Look for the installation guides or the user guides for any of those compliance modules. They walk you through this whole thing for that compliance focus. The second half of those guides talks about the controls in that compliance and what logarithm objects and tools and systems actually support those controls. And then we have the inverse. Sometimes you can see what logarithm object and find out which control it maps to. So you've got both kinds of mapping. So before you even think about necessarily turning on the rules or downloading them inside of the KB, just go look at those guides. Talk them over with your compliance team, talk them over with your auditor, saying, hey, we think this is the approach we're going to follow. It'll go an awfully long way to getting you started the right way.
When you go into community, do you search on their compliance to get those guides?
There's I think it's like KB module guides, and there it'll be for really any module that's released. It could be like a threat module, it could be a compliance module, and they'll have them broken out. There'll be a user guide, which is more of like a high-level overview of the module, and then deployment guide is really like, hey, we're ready to deploy, and here's all the things that need to happen.
So you go to community, it's under the documentation and downloads, top level, and there's a section for compliance modules. And it'll actually list all the compliance modules and link you to the guides. So where do you want to go next? I think we've got about somewhere between 5 and 10 minutes. We can probably take one more.
Burning. Sure. Yeah, that's something that's near and dear to me because we're currently building that out. So, as we mentioned before, this is 853 Rev 5, 800-171, and CSF. So 853, this is really what we consider as an influential compliance framework, meaning that a lot of other frameworks derive some of their objectives from it. A really good one to establish to build up your compliance program. 171 is a data-driven one around controlled unclassified data. So if you're working with any federal systems, you're required to be compliant with that.
So who's done NIST compliance? Anybody have to go through this?
Okay.
I've done caps,
Yeah.
military caps, and also SIGs.
Okay, yeah, SIGs, yeah.
So 171 is non-classified data, but it's you're working directly with government systems. So you much more narrow scope than 53. 53 is about pretty much any agency that works with federal government data of any kind ends up needing to be 53 compliant. But 53 is also one of those just great frameworks. If you want to show, improve your security posture in general, take a look at 853. It's not designed around HIPAA or SOX or Sarbanes, any of those things where you have specific data you're focused on. It's just good cybersecurity hygiene. And then CSF is kind of a lighter framework on top of that where nobody has to be cybersecurity framework compliant. In fact, there isn't a compliance there. There's just a set of really great guidelines for cybersecurity health and just in general.
Yeah, one of the great things about NIST from an organizational standpoint, if anybody's ever gone out and looked at how many different special publications they have, it's pretty immense. You get everything from a definition of controls through 853, all the way to some things like 883, which is more of a guidance in terms of how do you handle malware and respond, or how do you conduct a risk assessment. 830 will be a good resource for that. So one of the reasons why we went towards NIST was one, because they have all these resources that are available to give guidance in terms of building up your program, but then also they actively engage with their users. They have working sessions where they take feedback. Hey, we really need more clarity on this control objective, and then they go back and bake that in.
Right.
Granted, that takes a number of years to do, but
Right. So like 83, if you're trying to set up a SOC and improve the quality of your analysts, it's a great read. It's the kind of thing you pull as a book report with your team and kind of break through and say, what are we doing around this? 92, if you're trying to set up your SIM in the first place, is again a great read because it talks about what logs are, which log sources actually matter, why they matter, and what you might do with them. So lots of really great information in there that goes, doesn't go to I'm in compliance with NIST, it just helps you with your security posture overall. So our logarithm NIST module is a big one.
yeah.
How many controls?
We started with, I think, over 550, and we mapped to about 270 of them. And the degree to which we support those controls isn't necessarily determined by us. It's determined by your auditors. So that's where we encourage you to have those discussions with them to understand, hey, to what degree are we addressing this risk? Is there any other additional gap in there that we have to supplement?
And in terms of NIST, what are kind of typical in-scope systems?
Typical in-scope systems, we're talking about, thank you, security systems, data storage systems.
Anything that touches any of the federal data that brings you into 53 or 171.
Yeah.
But for CSF, it's a little bit different. CSF, you get to decide the scope because it's a best practices framework. It's not a mandated framework. And again, going into the guides, this is an example of a guide. NIST 853 attack rule. Here's the directly meets requirements, IR5, SI4.7 and .12. Augments these additional requirements. Here's what that actually rule applies to. It gives you all that information, all that mapping. So whether you have to do this, or your general counsel has to do this, your auditors have to do it, it's a great resource to go into the back of these guides and start looking at that cross-mapping. It's going to tell you very much what matters and what doesn't.
And Rob, you brought up a good point. All those different audiences that are involved in the audit, when we're designing the content around this, we're looking at how those different audiences can leverage it. So this might be you as a program developer. It might be your executive team wants to know the health of the compliance program. It might be your internal audit group, external audit group. And each one of those different audiences is going to leverage the data a little bit differently. And so we design the data so that each of those audiences can leverage it. The auditor's objective may be to attest against a control, whereas your control owner might be looking to use that data to empower and make sure that they're adhering to that.
And your SOC analyst might be, what do I do when this alarm pops up?
Yeah, and this is awesome, just from like a compliance geek standpoint, where they not only specify control objectives, they give additional supplemental guidance, and then they actually give assessment guidance, meaning that they give guidance in terms of how the auditors should generally go about testing those controls. So we actually leverage all that data in terms of developing our interpretation of those controls and how SIM can apply that.
I've only had my XM up for about 2 months. I've seen the modules, but I mean, the logarithm isn't scanning my environment. So if we go to like, you know, the NIST, the firewall configuration, I mean, is it looking for, like, would it alert on events that would happen if I wasn't in compliance?
Once you bring the log sources on, it has rules that will fire if, again, tie to the individual controls like this. So the firewall, I'm trying to think of NIST 53 with firewalls.
The specific
which kind of rules would fire?
Any rules?
Yeah, so, we're not going to tell you that you're out of compliance. We're going to tell you that something happened that needs to be considered around this compliance control. So the control says, nobody from China can come through your firewall. That's an example. There are some that are like that you've got blockages for certain countries. If we see traffic from that country, we're going to raise the alarm on it. Then you have to go evaluate, was this real? Was this something that I expected, something I didn't expect? Maybe my boss was going to the Olympics in Beijing. It might be okay.
Didn't tell us.
But if that's not happening, then it's a problem, and I want to work on it. So that's the kind of thing that those compliance rules are going to lift up. Plus, 6 months from now, they're going to give you the ability, from when the auditor says, "What are you doing around this control?" We're going to say, "Here's this control. Here's the number of times the alarms have fired, and what our responses to those alarms have been."
Yeah, so those control mappings really drive a lot of value in terms of if like a malware alarm fires, what controls are specifically going to be impacted.
So we're out of time, but I want to leave you with a couple of things. So first and foremost, go to community, check out the documentation that's up there. It's incredibly helpful. Bob and I are around. We'll answer questions today, tomorrow, anything you want to ask us. And a third thing, but I can't remember what.
Enjoy happy.
Enjoy happy hour.
Yeah.
So thanks for the time.